Sam&Cents. Money that finally makes sense. 2026. The United States-Iran conflict, the most important waterway in the oil trade, has effectively stopped working. Since the 28th of February, in the Energy Information Administration's own careful wording, most shipping traffic has stopped transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The International Energy Agency called what followed the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, and you know the story. Shut that strait, and oil goes to $150, $200, $300, and everything breaks. So, on the 21st of August, Brent settled at $94.39. It spiked to $144 at the peak, then came back down, and the traffic did not. Gold, which everybody knows goes up in a war, has fallen. And the dollar's share of the world's reserves, which everybody knows is collapsing, went up. 18 seafarers have been killed since February, but the thing everyone expects to be decisive was not. A government found that out 70 years ago in a crisis about a different canal. So if holding the canal did not decide it, what did? Britain ran that experiment on itself and left the answer in the paperwork. 1956. And yes, this is the government I promised you last time. Britain had the ships and the troops. British and French forces landed at Port Said and took a foothold in the canal zone, while the waterway itself sat blocked. And whatever else was happening at the canal and at the United Nations, the constraint the Treasury could not get around was the pound and access to dollars. And every time that story reaches something the present is doing again, I will stop and show you the modern version, not at the end, as we go. Now the warning label, because people still argue about this and I am not going to help them. This episode takes no position on whether what happened in 1956 was right or wrong. Not once, and not by implication. Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan and Dwight Eisenhower were all acting on incomplete information, and I will not tell you what any of them was thinking, because nobody can. This is not an episode about who was owed what. It is about a column of figures. General education, not personalized advice, and nothing in it is a reason to buy or sell anything. What was the Suez Canal financially? Financially, it was a pipe. In the words of the International Monetary Fund's own historian, a vital link in the transport of petroleum from the Middle East. So when the canal shut and the pipelines were cut too, Britain faced two squeezes at once, an oil squeeze and a currency squeeze, and the one that could force a cabinet's hand fastest was the currency. Oil came the long way now, and whoever sold it wanted paying in dollars. Britain did not print dollars. Britain had to buy them, and the dollars came out of the reserve, which Britain published every month. Britain in 1956 ran a fixed exchange rate. £1 was $2.80, set at the devaluation of 1949. And a fixed rate is not a description of what a currency is worth. It is a standing promise to defend that price in the market. Under the fund's rules, Britain had to keep official dealings within 1% of that parity, and in practice the Bank of England held it inside a tighter band still. The only thing that makes such a promise good is a pile of golden dollars. So watch what that pile has to do. It backs the price. It buys the oil. And much of it is not really Britain's, because other countries held sterling as a reserve and those holdings were claims. One pile, three jobs, and officials treated $2,000 million as the level it must not go below. Not a law, an internal action level. Britain published the reserve total every month. It never published that floor. Stop there, because that third job is doing something in the present tense right now. A reserve is not a vault in your own basement. It is largely an entry on somebody else's books, in somebody else's country, under somebody else's law. In February 2022, the Group of Seven, the European Union and the United States, prohibited transactions involving the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. Now hear the word, immobilized, not seized. Title did not move. The principle is still Russia's, it is still there, and Russia cannot touch it. What has actually been transferred to Ukraine is the interest that Pyle threw off while it sat still, not the principle. Those are different things, and almost everybody says the wrong one. So if nothing is taken, what does the damage? 1956 ran that experiment in public, with the numbers published every month, and the run on sterling did not begin with the invasion. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal Company at the end of July, and economists who went back through the daily records found confidence in the pound leaking from that summer on, months before any troops moved. Through the autumn, the reserves were, in the IMF's phrase, merely dripping away, Macmillan, the Chancellor, had a plan for the dollars he would need. There were three doors. Washington could ease the interest Britain owed on its wartime loans. Washington could lend through the Export-Import Bank, or Britain could draw on its own quota at the fund, and if you are listening carefully, you have already spotted the problem, because all three of them opened from the same side. Then at the end of October, the leak became something else. Israel moved into Sinai on the 29th. The British and French operation opened 2 days later, and according to the IMF's own account, that greatly accelerated the drain to a pace that clearly constituted a speculative attack. It is a promise to sell at your own price to whoever asks. When the asking turns into a run, you cannot decline, and you cannot close for the day. But who was buying? Two economists went into the Bank of England's own dealing room records to find out. About $120 million of it was oil companies, buying dollars to build emergency stocks. And $215 million was speculation and frightened private holders of sterling. Hold on to that list. And this is exactly where 2026 comes back, because we have just watched the same experiment run. In February, a choke point carrying about a fifth of the world's seaborne oil effectively shut, and stayed shut. If holding a choke point were the same as holding the world, the price would still be at $144. It is not. The International Energy Agency's members released 400 million barrels, the largest stock release in its history. Saudi exports through the Red Sea went from about 2 million barrels a day to over 5. A physical choke point has substitutes, spare capacity, strategic reserves, other routes. The system worked around it in about a quarter. Now hold that thought, because one thing in this story has no substitute at all. You have probably heard that America crashed the pound. Follow it back, and it does not end in an archive. It ends in a biography published in 2009, where the words are prepare to sell, and it means bonds, not the currency. That list I just gave you is what came back when researchers asked the Bank of England's own dealing room who was actually selling. Oil companies, commodity traders, frightened private holders. No American official body appears in it anywhere, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York acted as the bank's agent in that market, executing its operations there. The institution the story casts as the attacker was, in that market, working for the defense. The second thing everybody gets wrong is stranger. The famous scene, the 6th of November, the cabinet sitting, Macmillan telephoning New York to draw on the fund, and the answer coming back while they are still in the room, ceasefire first. It is in his memoirs, it is not in the archives. The State Department went looking and wrote the result into its own published record. No documentation concerning the British request or the American response has been found. The IMF's historian searched the fund's archives, the British Treasury files, and the American records, and concluded that how the request was made and who conveyed the refusal has never been established. The Bank of England's own official historian thought Macmillan probably never made the calls at all. I am not going to tell you he made it up. Nobody has shown that, and absence of a document is not proof. But notice what happens either way. If the call never happened, the conclusion gets stronger because he already knew the answer. Plenty of things pressed on that cabinet at once. The United Nations vote, the Soviet note, a divided country. The pound was not the only cause, it was the one the Chancellor could not argue with. And that door still exists. It is just that today there are three of them and almost everyone confuses them. Pipe 1 is messaging. That is SWIFT, a cooperative registered in Belgium which transmits payment instructions. It moves messages. It holds no money. Pipe 2 is clearing. Most cross-border dollar payments settle through an account at an American bank, and American authorities can require those accounts closed. Cut that, and dollars stop moving even if the messages still arrive. Pipe 3 is legal contagion, where a bank with no American business decides the risk is not worth it, and that one is mostly done by nobody, voluntarily, in advance. In June 2014, BNP Paribas pleaded guilty, paid nearly $9 billion, and suspended dollar clearing for certain business lines through its New York branch for a full year. A bank, not a country. Same door. So what does that cost a country? 56 is the one case where we can sit in the room. The 6th of November 1956. The cabinet meets, and Britain agrees to a ceasefire. And I have to be careful here because what the Chancellor said in that room is one of the most quoted things in this story, and one of the least documented. 3 different figures circulate for the losses he reported, and not one is sourced to the minute of that meeting. So I am not going to give you one. What is documented is what he said in public on the 4th of December. Reserves down $279 million in a month to $1,965 million. Below the level the Treasury had told itself it must not cross. And economists who later reconstructed the bank's own dealing records found the published change understated what had actually been spent in the market. Two different accounting questions, and the gap between them is why this month is still argued about. Before any of the fighting, the United States had set up an emergency committee of its major oil companies, with a plan to move Western Hemisphere oil to Europe if the canal closed. It was ready. And on the day the operation began, Washington switched it off. 2 days after the ceasefire, the National Security Council recorded the condition in its own minutes. Restart it when a ceasefire has been arranged and the United Nations force is functioning. On the 29th of November, the British cabinet adopted a withdrawal program. The oil plan was released to the American press at noon the next day. Now, nobody embargoed oil to Britain. What Washington declined to do was organize and coordinate an emergency lift, which is a different act, and once the condition was met, the money was there. On the 10th of December, the fund approved a drawing of $561.5 million, with a standby of $738.5 million behind it. Together, 100% of Britain's quota, and about 4 times any drawing the fund had ever made. Britain had planned to ask for 75. The proposal to go to 100 came from the American side. The same administration that declined to help in November organized the largest rescue in the fund's history in December, and the standby was never drawn, not $1. Macmillan called it money in the shop window. Now let me show you it is a mechanism and not a coincidence, because this keeps happening and you can put a date on every instance. 1956, the one we have just done. 1979, Iranian government assets frozen by executive order. 2012, Iranian banks disconnected from the messaging network by European regulation, reconnected in 2016, disconnected again in 2018. 2022, central bank reserves immobilized. And this July, a designation aimed at the fees charged to ships transiting a strait. In every single one, the target still physically holds the thing it holds. What gets removed is the ability to convert it, settle it, or spend it. And now where the comparison stops, because it does stop, and hard, Britain ran a fixed rate it was legally obliged to defend. Almost nobody runs that system now, and under a floating rate a currency falls, and falling is not the same as running out. The pressure lands in the price, not the vault. Second, and hold on to this one, Britain was not broke. The IMF's own historian is explicit. Through 1956 and 57, Britain ran a current account surplus, and the need for help came not from economics but from the psychological impact of a political crisis on financial markets. Britain was solvent. It simply could not reach enough dollars, fast enough on terms it set. Third, nothing was confiscated then or now, and fourth, Britain held $2.80 for another 11 years. It held the rate. It just could not hold it alone. So what does 1956 tell you about now? Not what is going to happen, I do not know, and neither does anybody else. It tells you where to look. For 6 months, the loudest story in the world has been a choke point, and it behaved exactly the way physical things behave. It hurt. It was expensive. People died. And the system rerouted around it in about a quarter. Meanwhile, the instruments that actually change what a government does were running on the other track the whole time. The most effective instrument in the whole affair was never used, and may never even have been spoken. There is no order to sell. There may not even have been a phone call. There was just a government that already knew the answer. So your 2 minutes, this whole episode is one distinction. The difference between money you own and money you can reach. 2 questions separate them. How long does it take to turn a thing into money you can actually spend? And how many other parties have to act before that happens? A platform, a bank, a network, a registrar. Those 2 questions are what the word liquid is doing when anybody uses it. They are not a forecast and not a recommendation, and they do not tell you to move anything. They just tell you how many people have to say yes. Next time, the man who read a paragraph as permitting a design the law never spelled out, and how doing nothing counts as agreeing to a number on your pay stub. Same channel. So there it is, small boring moves that quietly win. If your money makes a little more sense now, hit subscribe to Sam&Cents. And the next one's right here. It picks up right where this leaves off. See you there.